Can our cities survive climate change? It's one of the reasons Indonesia has decided to move its capital. Is this a solution to global warming? Or could it create an environmental disaster? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I am Hashem Ahelbarra. Indonesia's capital is collapsing. Overdevelopment, pollution and now climate change are forcing the government to move out of Jakarta. The city relies on pumping out groundwater for drinking and irrigation. But that's led to parts of the city sinking by up to 25 centimetres a year. With sea levels rising, Jakarta's population of 10 million is more exposed to floods than ever before. The government wants to build a new capital on the island of Borneo, more than 1,000 kilometres away. If approved, construction could begin next year and civil servants will move there from 2024.
We cannot continue the burden of Jakarta and the island of Java, which is getting heavier in terms of population density, severe traffic congestion, air pollution and water problems that we must immediately deal with. The place we've chosen has minimum risk of natural disasters, such as floods, earthquakes, tsunamis, forest fires, volcanoes and landslides. Secondly, the location is strategic as it's located in the center of Indonesia. And thirdly, it's close to other developed cities.
Now, Jakarta is not the only major coastal city threatened by climate change. Shanghai is consistently listed as one of the world's most vulnerable. Water extraction, massive infrastructure have caused the city to sink 2.6 meters. And if temperatures continue to rise, millions of inhabitants could be displaced. The Nigerian city of Lagos suffers from the effects of rising sea levels, and the lack of adequate drainage makes the flooding worse. It's estimated a 20-centimetre rise in seawater would make 750,000 people homeless. In the US, parts of the flood-prone city of Houston have been sinking around 5 centimetres a year, with oil and gas extraction worsening the situation. Let's bring in our guest. Here in the studio is Anto Mohsin, an Indonesian assistant professor in residence at Northwestern University in Qatar. In Jakarta, via Skype, Jasmine Puteri, senior forest campaigner for Greenpeace Indonesia. And in Copenhagen, Emmanuel Raju, assistant professor of disaster management at the University of Copenhagen. Welcome to the program. And to relocating the capital city, is it the right move?
Well, the decisions to move the capital city Jakarta to East Kalimantan, I believe, signals three things. Nationally, President Joko Widodo wants to be more inclusive for the conception of Indonesia geographically. Economically, he wants to move away from the Java-centric economic development that has been dominated the economic development in the country. And environmentally, as he said in his announcement, he wants to alleviate some of the burdens that Jakarta, right now the biggest city in Indonesia, and reduce the number of population there.
But what politicians say sometimes may not really be reflecting reality, and Greenpeace does not seem to be really happy with this move. Jasmine?
Yeah, we see that the moving process is very hasty and there was no inclusive process. And it seems like Greenpeace see this as a threat for environmental costs because we already did some analysis and it seems the new capital will be allocated near to the conservation and protected areas on the north part and the southern part. That is our main concern. And then not to mention, they need a vast amount of land, and we are pretty much sure that there will be a land conversion in the process.
Emmanuel,
and it will contribute to deforestation.
Sure. Emmanuel, should the government retrofit Jakarta itself or move to another location to achieve sustainability?
Well, it's a very difficult question that's a lot of governments will start facing with regard to these sort of urban challenges. It was not very long ago, if you look at a World Bank report in 2010, which said that we might have to consider some of these relocations, or governments might start considering some of the relocations in the future, and that future is already now. So I think there's a lot of questions. If Indonesia it really needs to consider sort of the environmental damages it could sort of bring up. What would happen inside the country? How will this sort of build a new? Will the new city? How should the new city be built? I think that's an important consideration to be made. Whether or not you rebuild, and this is the question primarily that comes up almost after every disaster, is how do you rebuild? How do you recover from disaster? Whether you rebuild in the same location, whether you are forced to move, and I think those are very difficult questions, and one would not have an easy answer to that.
Since these are difficult questions, as Emmanuel said, Anto, don't you think that this is something that should have been debated extensively at the Parliament, with NGOs, environmental agencies, and also the indigenous population should be involved? What we've seen so far is that this has been a unilateral approach by the government, by the president himself.
Of course, all those stakeholders, the groups of people that you mentioned, need to be consulted. But it hasn't necessarily been a final decision yet, because the president needs an approval from the parliament. So one of the debates that can occur is in the parliament that can bring all those groups together in the conversation.
Jasmine, do you think that the parliament would take into consideration that moving to a new area could endanger a fragile ecosystem, endanger species there? Is this going to be a top priority for the parliament?
Well, the parliament, from the parliament perspective, there is this political statement earlier today. They said that they are basically agree to the concept, and then not to mention that the government already city concept with forest concept. But this is also a big question, what kind of concept and design that is, because there hasn't been any comprehensive dialogue or a comprehensive design that have been consulted to the public. But yes, from Greenpeace perspective, this will be very environmentally threatening.
Emmanuel, is it safe to say that this is something that could potentially alleviate some of the concerns there moving to a new place? Because my concern is this could bring us back to square one, because when you move to a new location, you will have more people, you have overcrowding, over-exploitation of water, so back to the same environmental disaster that were created in different mega cities like Jakarta.
Absolutely, and I think that's really an important consideration to be talking. And as Jasmine said, this really we should be talking about really an all-inclusive dialogue, all-inclusive approach, primarily because there are no natural disasters. There are only natural hazards, and disasters are actually human-made. So a lot of, every time we say natural disasters and blame it either on climate change or extreme weather, that's not the case. That's only a hazard. But it's about how we build the city. That's what causes the disaster. And you're right that this could, this whole move, it depends on how this new city is envisioned in this place, in Indonesia, or in many other parts of the world. We see massive sort of urbanization processes without taking into account some of the marginalized populations. Very often that we see after disasters, who is affected? The important question is who's affected? Why are certain groups affected more than the others? And whether or not these questions will come into play is an important factor, because a lot of times we see after every disaster that it is the most marginalized, the vulnerable groups that get affected more and more. And these are all questions of power, structure, money, and very importantly, even lack of access to basic resources to some of these people.
And also it's an issue of mismanagement because, Anto, this is not the first time that international experts have been saying Jakarta will have one day to face this reality because of blunders and mismanagement and poor planning. So while the government seems to be setting aside those real issues and saying, you know what, we have to move to a new location.
I think you have to divide the issues of Jakarta facing all these dangers, as you say. It's sinking faster in the northern part, in particular, air pollution, traffic congestions and all that, with the idea of having Jakarta as a capital city. Okay? I think President Joko Widodo mentioned in his announcement that when he moved the capital from Jakarta to these new locations, Jakarta will not necessarily be abandoned, will not necessarily be neglected or forgotten even. Jakarta will always face those problems. But the city has been the center of socio-cultural, economic, politics, life of the country for so long. So perhaps by moving part of that center, the political center, the economic center, Jakarta would be able to face these issues that it's been having a little bit easier without having to worry that this is also the capital city of the country.
But then again, we're talking about past governments that squandered billions of dollars. There was embezzlement of public funds, massive corruption, and they seem to have forgotten the core issues, which is the need to further upgrade infrastructure in vulnerable areas like Jakarta. They didn't do that.
Well, you have to remember that the current president, President Joko Widodo, used to be the governor of Jakarta for a brief period of time before he ran for the presidency in 2014. So he knew some of these issues that Jakarta is facing. I believe that he saw that what you said, mismanagements in the past, blunders, lack of planning, can be the process can be redone in a new way.
And this explains why they are moving to a new location. Jasmine, I mean, many governments would tell you that moving to a new or creating a new mega city using technology, using automated cars, green cities, that could answer some of the concerns that you have voiced at Greenpeace. Do you think that a new mega city is what Indonesia needs at this particular moment?
Well, from Greenpeace perspective-wise, we really want to stick with the idea that the new capital will only function as the administrative center. We are thinking to have it like Canberra, so it doesn't have to be in a big, massive area required as what it is stated, 180,000 hectares. So, and in terms of if they really want to make it sustainable, but like the public does not have any idea yet what kind of sustainability that they are trying to promote, because they always say that it's a green, sustainable forest city. And if you want to make it as a mega city, I believe that it won't be that sustainable. And then not to mention, as looking back to the history of Jakarta, Jakarta was not designated as this big city as what we have today. And then we're afraid that there will be sprawl of population in the new city, in the new capital. So it will basically recreate or even replicate the environmental problems in the new capital.
Emmanuel, climate experts say basically that because of the climate change, we are most likely to see most of the coastal cities submerged underwater. So is relocation the answer to these problems?
Well, I'm not a climate scientist, so I'm not going to comment on the exact numbers or some of the reports that have come out in terms of whether or not 2050 is the time. But I definitely think what is important is that we are continuing to see that there are extreme weather events increasing. We see that. whether we see disasters and whom does disaster affect. But I think it's extremely important to look at what Jasmine was saying in terms of not recreating risk, not recreating vulnerability. Every time we see a new event, a new process, because disasters are processes, they are social processes. And I think it's extremely important to sort of to bring closer the fields of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, and how do we make sure that our cities are built in a more resilient manner? How do we make sure that this is a holistic development process?
Anto, when you look at Jakarta in particular, you have two things here. You have overuse of groundwater, which brings the clay layer to further contract,
Right.
and then the city to further sink.
Correct.
And you have the sea levels, which are rising over the last few years because of the climate change. Now the government is offering what many people say this is just a placebo. Instead, the government should be really teaching the people about the need to rethink their daily life to be able to cope with an ever-changing reality.
I agree. News coverage and studies have been disseminated in the government circle, in the media for a long time now, that Jakarta is sinking because a large part of the population have been pumping groundwater at a rate more than it is being discharged by rainwater. One of the reasons that keeps happening is because the company that supply water, the company that's supposed to supply water through the tap, water for drinking, cannot meet the demands of the Jakarta population. And even though it seems attempts have been made to try to stop the pumping of groundwater, it keeps continue because many of the residents in Jakarta would ask, where do we get our water?
Exactly.
But, again,
which brings us back to the issue of poor planning.
You have to understand now.
You don't make any projections in the future about the city, which is going to further grow and grow and grow and grow. And therefore, the government should put into place mechanisms to answer some of the needs of the people. They fail, people tap into the aquifers.
Correct.
And this is what we're facing now.
Yes, of course. And which is why we need to separate the issue of moving the capital from these issues that Jakarta is facing, because Jakarta will be continue facing these issues in the future, regardless whether the capital city is still going to be in Jakarta or will be moved to other locations. But I'd like to echo what Jasmine and also Emmanuel said earlier, that to build a better, more sustainable capital city in these locations, considerations how the city should be built must be on the top agenda of the government. So planning must be really made well. And the idea that the city should just be the administrative center of the entire nation should also be in the mind of the government. So Jakarta will still face all those problems, those issues that they're seeing right now. The residents will not all necessarily move elsewhere. But I think one of the hopes is by moving one of Jakarta's role as the political center elsewhere, maybe the government of Jakarta can do a little bit more serious planning, like you said.
Jasmine, the government says that it needs something like $25 to $30 billion to build a new capital city, and that by 2024, civil servants will be operating there. Do you see it as a plausible deadline?
Well, looking at to other countries' past experience, for example, like Putrajaya and then Brasilia, I don't think that would be possible to really move the city within 5 years ahead. And then not to mention, to touch down what Anto has said, we also believe that it is very important to have very robust spatial planning and to make sure that spatial planning really using the carrying capacity, environmental as the fundamental of carrying capacity consideration, because by moving a lot of people like approximately the civil servants, they really have to see how the spatial planning is being composed and being considered, because there will be a lot of people over there, and environmental considerations, the carrying capacity environmental wise should be very on the backbone of the spatial planning.
Mm-hmm. Emmanuel, when you have the leader of the most powerful country in the world, the US, who is climate change skeptic, and you see the unprecedented hurricanes all over the world, glaciers that are shrinking, and an outcome that could have a biblical impact on of biblical proportions in the future. In terms of disaster management, what do you think the international community should be doing in the near future?
That's a very, very important discussion, and I think what we need to continue to do is to garner more and more political will and more political support. There are countries which are taking really legal steps in this direction, creating new legal frameworks, putting new legal mechanisms in place to protect our cities, to stop people from creating disaster risk. And I think we need to continue to go in that direction, and important discussions need to happen at the COP summit, for example, that is going to happen in December in Chile, to sort of start discussing this to bring more and more political will around this subject.
Anto, do you see the Indonesians willing to move towards that direction, bringing about new legal systems, raising awareness among the people about the need to change their lifestyles because of the changing realities?
I believe with how news are being more global now, more awareness is happening in the country. And because of that, and how the Indonesian political system, we've been experimenting with a more democratic political system, more voices from the people who are aware of this issue will be raised. And so to continue the legitimacy of the government, they would need to hear what the people have to say. But I would like to add what Emmanuel said. Political will, it is important, but as a teacher, raising awareness among the young generation is equally, if not more important, because they will be in charge of many decision-making in the future.
Jasmine, I mean, building a mega city goes against all the recommendations by climate change advocates, because their aim is to reduce greenhouse emission. A mega city will produce more emissions. Do you think that the Indonesians will ultimately be able to implement some very robust, environment-friendly laws to change their habits, their way of life?
Well, just like what Anto already said, as well what Emmanuel said, that this is the importance of the political will and political push. And looking at the international commitment that Indonesia is having, which is translated into the NDC, the National Determined Contributions, it seems that there hasn't been a very strong political push from the government in terms of environmental protection. And then not to mention that Indonesia hasn't really showed the strong willingness to transition from the fossil fuel to renewable energy. And not to mention, like for example, Greenpeace identified that there are a lot of coal mining sites in that province, in the designated new capital. And this will be another problem, because we believe that coal will be the source of energy there, and it will emit further emissions from the new capital. So this is something that we really flag out.
I have to say that the decision by the government to move the capital is making headlines all over the world, and I hope this is going to further raise international awareness before climate change gets to the point of no return. Anto, Mohsin, Jasmine, Puteri, Emmanuel, Raju, thank you very much indeed for your contribution to the program.
Thank you.
And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem, Ahelbarra, and the whole team here. Bye for now.